All right, so there has been this report out, and it sparked this conversation. Now, again, this report is about the Cleveland Browns wanting to get a new stadium built with $1 billion of publicly funded money, which is just okay. Now, again, there you can have your opinions on whether these stadiums should be publicly funded. Me personally, no, don't think they should be publicly funded. I think you should build your own stadium. But that's a whole different conversation. But what this has sparked is the debate, the long debates. I mean, they Browns been doing this since the team left in '95. Should the Browns build a dome? Should they build a stadium? Or should they try to get the best of both worlds with a retractable roof? Now, I'm going to try to do my best to placate all the arguments, so at least I'm being fair here. The open air stadium, the reason for keeping this is mainly tradition, right? There's no other logical reason to keep a open air stadium in Cleveland other than it's always been an open air stadium. That's mainly the argument, right? It's always been this way. It wouldn't feel like Cleveland Browns football if it's not outside. We like the snow. We like the rain. We like the elements. It gives us a home field advantage. Now, that home field advantage, highly debatable whether that's actually there, given the Browns' home record over the years. Also, it's also just debatable how much that affects a team's ability to win at home, right? Is if they play in the elements, given that, most of the time they're practicing in the stadium, it's during the summertime. So that element of it is one thing. I know people like the open air stadium. They like how it looks. And again, the argument for an open air stadium is going to be more emotional, right? Open air stadiums look better. They can have better dynamic construction, right? Look at Seattle Stadium, where it's a open air stadium. It's one of the most unique looking structures in the NFL. A lot of open air stadiums are able to differentiate themselves a lot easier than domes. I mean, how many times have you just seen a football game in a dome and it's looked like it could be at any stadium in the world? But if you watch a game that's going on in Ralph Wilson Stadium, it looks way different. If you watch a game that's going on in Lambeau Field, it looks and feels way different. There is an emotional element to having an open air stadium. That is a valid argument, right? I know it's not based on the most logical stuff. If you're just looking at a spreadsheet, it's not going to make a ton of sense. But there is some merit to having an open air stadium, because sports isn't really about logic as much as a lot of people want to make it think. It's about emotion, right? And the emotion that a outdoor stadium can provide is different. For whatever reason, when we do stuff outside, it feels different than doing it inside, right? It's why we go to them watch parties for the Cavs when they about to win the championship, and it's raining, right? Like, it's why we just like being outside. Human beings like to be outdoors. They like to celebrate things outdoors, and being outdoors just feels different than being indoors, mainly because we're probably supposed to be outdoors more than we are right now. But that's really the argument for the outdoor stadium. If you're looking at this from a spreadsheet perspective, it makes no sense. If you're looking at this from a customer experience, an average customer experience perspective, it makes no sense. But if you're looking at this from a traditional standpoint and a diehard like traditionalist, like there's a lot of diehard fans who don't want to go to the stadium because it's too cold, and that doesn't make you any less of a fan, because that's a valid point. It is freezing cold at that stadium, but yeah, it's more or less those people who really want to keep it traditional, who like how the outdoor aesthetics look, right? They like how that snow looks. It makes them feel like they're watching what they know to be Cleveland Browns football. Cleveland Browns football in a dome to them would be more sterile and wouldn't have the emotional impact that the outdoor stadium has, right? That's mainly the argument there. It's a more valid argument than I think people who only look at stuff through spreadsheets have make it out to be. But it is an argument with its own merits. Now there are people who want a completely domed stadium, and this makes sense on paper for everybody, right? A dome stadium is a better experience on paper for fans because the temperature is controlled. A dome football stadium is a better experience for the players because the temperature is controlled. A dome football stadium is a better experience for the people who build it because you can have more events and a wider variety of events. Like you can get WrestleMania if you really wanted to, or something like that. Like if it's a big event, you want to get the Final Four, you want to make a bid to get the Final Four in Cleveland, you can make the bid now because you have the dome, right? You can get those kind of events that are restricted for open air stadiums. So it makes a ton of sense. It makes more sense. I mean, there was back in the 90s, people wanted to build one giant retractable dome and just have it be for baseball, football, and basketball because it's efficient. Now, we've moved away from being that efficient with our structures, and now we've moved to this more inefficient, extravagant era of sports stadiums building, which I think is probably going to end sometime soon. But that's the argument for a dome. It just makes sense. It makes sense for people. It is not the emotional thing to do, but it makes a ton of sense. My issue with the dome is if you're not careful with how you build a dome is a really sterile environment. I don't know how many of you guys have been to Ford Field. Ford Field is a terrible place to see a football game. Not because like the sightlines are not great or anything, but when you're sitting in there, it just feels sterile. It just feels boring. There's nothing unique. It just feels like you're in a giant arena. And arenas are cool when they're arena size, but if you've ever been in a stadium size arena, it sucks. It really does suck. Now, newer domes are better at this, right? Mercedes-Benz in Atlanta is an amazing experience. And I'll get to stadiums like that in a minute. But that's the main issue with domes. One, people kind of have this stigma about them that they don't feel like football. Now, there's been advancements that I'm going to talk about later to make that feel more like football, to make it more, because some people still think you can only get natural grass on an outdoor stadium. You can get that with the retractable dome, with the indoor stadium, like however you want to get natural grass, you can get a natural grass stadium, however your stadium is built. That's no longer a benefit of the outdoor stadium. And that's why the outdoor stadium makes no sense on paper. There's just no benefit to doing it. But emotionally for the fans, it's what they want. Well, a lot of fans want. The indoor stadium, again, it's a better experience because it's temperature controlled. But you do miss some of the atmosphere that you get with the outdoor stadium, right? It doesn't look as unique. It doesn't feel as unique. It feels more like a basketball game when you're sitting in a dome than it does like a football game because we just associate the game of football with the outdoors. It's just a fact, right? So it doesn't feel quite right? And then that leads people to land on what I would say is the most common suggestion between everybody who wants a new stadium. And I would make the argument that this would probably be the worst suggestion. Even though it's the most common one, and that is the retractable dome. Now, Quincy, why in the world do you think a retractable dome is a terrible idea? One, it really matters where you put the stadium. A lot of people are dead set on putting that stadium by the lake. Okay, that's cool. If it's an open air stadium, it doesn't make sense for a domed or retractable stadium. Open air stadium, you can argue that the wind makes it a home field advantage for the football team. I don't think it does, but you can make that argument, and that's a valid enough argument. For a retractable roof or a dome, it makes no sense to build that thing next to the lake because just water next to steel, not a good idea, even though it's not like salt water. It's not going to corrode the steel like it does in Hawaii with that stadium, but it's still not a good idea to have a stadium with a ton of moving parts, right? Like a retractable roof next to a huge body of water. It's just not a great idea. And it serves no benefit to have it next to there unless you want to have it, look pretty for aesthetic reasons. But here's why I don't think the retractable dome is a good idea. One, retractable domes are way, way more expensive to build, cost way more resources when it comes to just the entire budget of the stadium. Let's say they're going to spend $1 billion anyways, right? Building the retractable dome is going to take so much of that budget because it requires a ton of moving parts. It requires a ton of maintenance for a mechanism that you can argue is pretty pointless. in a retractable roof. Again, I think the retractable roof makes people feel better about the ideal of having a roof stadium because you can go, well, it's not really a dome, right? Because a lot of people's issues with a dome is that it's a dome, but if it's a retractable roof, it's not really a dome, right? And that's how people kind of land on it. But it's worse than a dome because it's a roof that's not as good as being a roof as a roof. And it's a open air stadium that's horrible at being an open air stadium, right? It's the worst of both worlds. And I think this is why people are doing less and less retractable roofs or scaling down the retractable roofs that they do because it just makes less sense, especially up north. If people don't realize this, there's not a lot of retractable roofs up north, right? A lot of them down south because the main purpose of a retractable roof really isn't to keep water out. Like, that's cool that they could stop the rain and all of that in a football stadium. But the main reason a lot of teams have retractable roofs are so if it's sunny out, they can let the sun in if it's a reasonable temperature. But if that sun is too hot, because that's a thing, I know we in Cleveland, we don't really know about that one. But if it's too hot, you want to get the sun out of there. Right. And that's why you would close the roof when it's sunny. So it makes sense in states like Florida. It makes sense in states like Texas that have these retractable roofs. But in states that experience heavy weather, it really doesn't make any sense because you're going to have the roof closed 99% of the time. Right. The only time you'll have the roof open is if you want to let some sunlight in. And why build a mechanism for that when you can have a more translucent ceiling built like US Bank has, right? I mean, if you look at US Bank, look at that, right? It's like a kind of see-through kind of deal. SoFi Stadium has it. So does the Raiders' new stadium has, all while having a fixed roof, right? Like, that's the best way to go about it. And if you look at which cities have these retractable roofs, you'll notice that, you know, most of these retractable roofs are either not used that much or they're in the South because it just doesn't make much sense, right? Lucas Oil Stadium, I think, is the one retractable roof in the NFL that is up north. And I think that stadium suffers because of that design tremendously, because if you've ever watched a Indianapolis Colts game, I know you've seen it during their day games where half of the field is so insanely bright that you can't see it, and the other half is this deep shadow, right? Because they can't control how the light comes in because they're just opening and closing this apparatus, and you end up not seeing half the field, and it drives me crazy every time I see an Indianapolis Colts game. Every time I have to watch the Colts on all 22 film, it is not a fun experience, and it just lets in a lot of harsh sunlight. It just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense to build a retractable dome because what would be the point, right? If the whole charm of an open air stadium is the ability to let harsh elements in, but you have a retractable roof to keep the harsh elements out, then what is the point of having that roof open, right? Maybe you want to get sunlight in. Okay, build a more translucent roof. Maybe you want to, have the natural grass, right? Okay, cool. You can have the sun come through the roof. It'll grow the grass. Like that's happened. But the ideal of building a retractable dome when it's going to add a ton of maintenance costs to get moving parts. And sometimes these moving parts don't even get used. Have you ever heard of the Texans and the NRG stadium that they have there? They rarely, if ever, open that stadium. It happened like once in 6 years, right? If you read here, on November 22nd of 2022, something historic happened at NRG Stadium. The Texans opened the roof for a home game. Before that, it had been 6 years since the crew had rolled back the top of NRG Stadium. 6 years. Think about how much added cost that retractable dome was. They've used it once in 6 years. Does that make very much sense? And that's in Texas, right? The reason they can only use it once in 6 years is mainly because It takes forever for these things to open and close. These are gigantic doors. They take like a day to open almost, right? So you have to know before the day starts whether you want that thing to be open, and it's just better to not risk it and keep it closed. Or you could go with something like Atlanta has, which is a much smaller open roof, right? Where it's just like this halo over the 50-yard line. And at this point, I got to ask y'all, what's the point? I've been in this stadium, and it is a tremendous experience, but the open air part of it don't matter. You barely notice it when you're in there. It makes absolutely no difference to the experience on whether that dome is open or closed. It is no difference. No difference. Now, here's why I do think the Browns will eventually get a new stadium. Cleveland Browns Stadium is lacking in a lot of elements when it comes to modernization. The Wi-Fi in that stadium is awful. The experience at the third deck of that stadium is quite terrible. I've had season tickets in that area, and when it came from winter, it is one of the worst experiences in football. The escalator that takes you up breaks down constantly. That's the only way to get up unless you want to go through that. I don't even know what you want to call it. It's not even a spire. It's just like 10 miles of concrete that you got to walk up to get all the way up to the top of Cleveland Browns Stadium. Because again, there are very limited ways to get to the top. It's just built very poorly. It is not the most well thought out constructed stadium, especially once you get higher and higher in the stadium. And then by the time you get to the top of that stadium, keep in mind, it'll be December and it's freezing up there because that thing is next to a lake. It is windy and it's already cold, and it's a terrible experience. It is a terrible experience. A lot of people like the ideal of it, don't go to the games because it's cold, right? So that keeps people away. Now, it's not like the Browns have problems selling tickets, but you want to sell as many tickets as possible, and a dome is the reason to go. Now, what do I think will ultimately happen with the Browns? I think by 2030, there's probably going to be a new stadium built. This stadium is aging rapidly. It's getting older by the minute. They have to keep putting $10 million here, $20 million here to keep it functional and upright. And even then, the experience isn't great from a modern sensibility standpoint. Like, they don't have the stuff that a lot of other stadiums have. Just something small like being able to track your fantasy football stuff in the stadium is a nightmare because they don't have enough space on the banners to be able to do it, the LED boards, and they also don't have great Wi-Fi. So on one side of the stadium, you can see fantasy football stuff. On the other side of the stadium, you can't, right? Because the Wi-Fi is terrible, and they don't have the banner on both sides of the stadium. Something as small as that because they don't have enough space, right? Again, it just doesn't make sense for them to continue playing out there. That stadium that was built there in 99, it's not Lambeau Field. It was not built to last. It was built to get up there quick, and it's showing its age right now. It's kind of amazing that it stayed as long as it has right now, but it's not built to last. So they're probably going to have to build a new stadium. This is probably going to mean that the Haslam's are going to have to fund it more, and they should. And if the Haslam's fund this, it's going to be a dome stadium because that's just what makes sense. It makes more sense for people who want to go to the stadium to have it be in a domed area because the temperature control thing, like, that's a real thing. People don't want to be sitting, like, some people want to sit in the dog pound in -5-degree weather, and God bless y'all. But a lot of people want to sit in 75-degree weather and watch a football game. Even though it don't necessarily feel like how we remember football, that's how they want to watch it. And that's how most people want to watch it. Most sane people, at least. But yeah, it's probably going to be a dome stadium. And it makes sense because also another element in this, and this is the football aspect of it, is that having an outdoor stadium is more of a detriment to your team in a modern era than it is anything helpful, especially if you live in a cold weather city, just because it hampers your ability to pass the ball at times. And that's what the league is built around. So if you're making your life harder on that front, you're not helping yourself. Like, I'm not saying this is the reason Aaron Rodgers has not been to another Super Bowl. Let me be clear on this. But there is a reason why Aaron Rodgers has not been to as many Super Bowls as you would want, because he's a pass-heavy guy on a pass-heavy team that plays in Lambeau Field for the NFC Championship game, right? I believe the one time he got to the Super Bowl, he was on the road in a dome. So it just is not helpful for the football team. It's not helpful for the people who own the stadium. It's not really that great for the majority of the people who would go to a stadium, right? For the diehards and the traditionalists, they're going to be pissed. They're going to be upset. But I would say soak in your open air on the lakefront stadium while you have it, because I think in the near future, within the next 10, 15 years, you're going to have a dome stadium, probably, closer to downtown, or maybe even out of the city of Cleveland in like the Canton area or something like that, sooner rather than later, because that's just how things are going. But that's just my thoughts on the new stadium. Let me know what you think. If they build a new stadium, where should it be, and what kind of stadium should it look like? But again, guys, thank you all for watching. Y'all have a great day. Have a good night.